Some secrets don't stay buried, they wait to be found by the right eyes. Clara Bennett kept her head down as she wiped the counter for the third time in 10 minutes, even though it was already spotless, the small cafe on Maple Street humming with the low comfort of routine, coffee machines hissing, spoons clinking, voices soft and forgettable, exactly the kind of place she had chosen on purpose, exactly the kind of life she had built piece by piece, quiet, invisible, safe, but safety had rules. And Clara followed every one of them, never staying out late, never sharing too much, never letting anyone look too closely, especially not at her son. Ethan sat in the corner booth with a box of crayons, his small sneakers swinging inches above the floor, drawing in careful silence, a habit that had always unsettled her because he noticed things, patterns, details, things children weren't supposed to understand. Clara glanced at him, just once, just enough to make sure he was still there, still within reach, and then she saw it, the paper in his hands, the shape forming beneath bright blue and red lines. Her breath caught before she could stop it, a symbol, simple, almost childish, but unmistakable, something she hadn't seen in years, something she had prayed never to see again. Her fingers tightened around the damp cloth, knuckles pale, as a quiet chill moved through her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, just a child's imagination, but her instincts didn't agree. They never did. The bell above the cafe door chimed, soft. Ordinary, but Clara felt it like a shift in the air, like pressure changing before a storm. She didn't look up immediately, she never did, but the room changed anyway. Conversations dipped, not stopped, just lowered, as if something unseen had stepped inside and asked for space. Then she looked, just for a second, and saw him, tall, composed, dressed too sharply for a place like this, his presence quiet but undeniable, like he belonged anywhere he chose to stand. His dark eyes moved once across the room, not searching, not rushed, just observing, until they landed on Ethan, and stayed there. Clara's heartbeat stuttered, not from fear alone, but from recognition of something deeper, something she couldn't explain but understood all the same. Ethan looked up from his drawing at the exact same moment. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, neither of them moved. The boy didn't smile, didn't look away, he just stared, calm, curious, unafraid, and that was when the man's expression shifted, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Clara saw it, the smallest pause, the smallest fracture in control, like a realization forming behind his gaze. She moved instantly, crossing the room in 3 quick steps, her hand closing gently but firmly around Ethan's shoulder. Time to go, she said, her voice steady, controlled, but lower than usual. Ethan blinked up at her, confused, but he didn't argue. He never did. She grabbed his drawing without thinking, folding it once, then again, as if hiding it could erase it, as if distance could undo what had already happened. She turned toward the door, but before she reached it, a voice cut through the space behind her, low, calm, certain. "You're leaving early." Clara froze, just for a second, just long enough to know it was already too late. Then she turned, slowly, meeting his eyes fully for the first time, and in that moment, she understood the truth she had spent years running from, not hidden, not forgotten, just waiting, because some pasts don't disappear, they watch, they follow, and eventually, they find you. Clara did not answer right away because answering meant acknowledging him, and acknowledging him meant everything she had built was already starting to crack. Her hand tightened slightly around Ethan's shoulder as she turned fully, her expression calm in a way that had taken years to master, the kind of calm that looked natural but was anything but. "We are closing early," she said, her voice even, controlled, the same tone she used with difficult customers. But he did not move, did not look around, did not question the lie. He simply watched her, and that silence said more than any confrontation ever could. Ethan shifted beside her, his small fingers still clutching the edge of his folded drawing, unaware of the weight hanging in the air. "Mom," he whispered, his voice soft, curious, and Clara forced a small smile without taking her eyes off the man. "It is okay, sweetheart," she said gently, but her pulse told a different story, because the man stepped closer, not fast, not threatening, just deliberate, like someone who understood exactly how much space he needed to take to change everything. "You moved far," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, each word precise, controlled. 6 states. New name. New routine. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her, not physically, but in that deeper way, the way truth settles when it can no longer be denied. She had been careful, she had erased herself, she had become someone else, and yet he was standing here like none of that had mattered, like he had always known exactly where to find her. "You have the wrong person," she replied, steady, automatic. The lie practiced so many times it almost sounded real, but his eyes did not change, they did not flicker with doubt or confusion, they simply held her in place. "Clara Rossi," he said, and the name landed between them like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Ethan looked up at her again, sensing the shift now, sensing something was wrong. Clara felt it, the moment everything tightened, but she did not react, not outwardly, because reacting would confirm it, would make it real. "We need to leave," she said softly to Ethan, guiding him toward the door again, but this time, she knew he would not let it end that easily. "He draws it without knowing," the man continued, his gaze flicking briefly to the folded paper in Ethan's hand. "That is not taught." Clara stopped, just for a fraction of a second, and that was enough for him to see, enough for him to understand that he was right, that whatever connection he suspected was not imagination. "It is just a drawing," she said. But the words felt thinner now, weaker, because even she did not believe them anymore. "Children do not create symbols they have never seen," he replied calmly, and there was no accusation in his tone, just certainty, the kind that came from someone used to being right, always. Ethan tugged lightly at Clara's sleeve. "Mom, who is he?" The question hung in the air, simple, innocent, and impossible to answer. Clara swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, because there were 1,000 answers, and none of them were safe. The man's gaze softened, just slightly, as it moved to the boy, not warm, not gentle, but something less sharp than before, something almost curious. "That depends," he said slowly, his eyes returning to Clara. "On what you tell him." Clara felt it then, not fear alone, but something heavier, the realization that this was not just about her anymore. It had not been for a long time. She had been running for two people, hiding for two lives, and now both of them were standing in front of the one person she could not outrun. The cafe around them continued in quiet confusion, customers pretending not to notice, the world moving as if nothing had changed, but for Clara, everything already had, because he took one more step forward, close enough now that his voice did not need to rise. "You ran from your past," he said, calm, controlled, "but you did not run far enough," and Clara knew, in that exact moment, that leaving would not be escape, not anymore. Not when he had already found what she had spent years trying to hide. Clara knew she could not stand there any longer because every second she stayed gave him more time to see, to connect, to confirm what she had spent years keeping hidden. So she moved, not abruptly, not enough to draw attention, but with quiet determination as she guided Ethan toward the door, her hand steady even as her thoughts raced. The bell chimed again as she pushed it open and the cool afternoon air hit her face, sharp, grounding, but he followed, not rushed, not aggressive, just present, and that presence alone was enough to make escape feel like an illusion. The parking lot stretched ahead, a few scattered cars, nothing unusual, nothing threatening, and yet everything felt different now, smaller somehow, like the world had narrowed down to the space between her and him. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Ethan asked softly, his voice carrying that careful tone he used when he sensed something was wrong but did not understand why. Clara crouched slightly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, forcing her voice to stay calm. "No, sweetheart, we are just going home," she said, and for a moment, she almost believed it, but then the sound of footsteps stopped just behind them, close enough that she could feel it without turning. "You always say that," the man said quietly, and the words were not meant for the child. Clara straightened slowly, her back stiff, her mind calculating every option, every distance, every possibility, but there were too many variables now, too many unknowns. She turned again, meeting his gaze, refusing to let him see the fear building beneath the surface. "What do you want?" she asked, direct this time, no more deflection, no more pretending, because pretending had already failed. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not anger, not impatience, just focus. "I want the truth," he said simply, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, more dangerous than any threat could have been. Clara let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against Ethan's shoulder as if grounding herself in something real. "You do not need the truth," she replied, quieter now, not weaker, but more controlled, like she was choosing each word carefully. "You need to leave us alone." For a brief moment, silence settled between them, the distant hum of traffic filling the space. And then he shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. "That is not how this works," he said, and Clara felt it again, that shift, that reminder that he did not operate within the same boundaries she did, that his world did not allow things to simply be left alone. Ethan looked between them, his small hand tightening around the folded paper. "Mom, I forgot my crayons," he said suddenly, his voice uncertain, and the normalcy of the statement cut through everything. Clara hesitated. Just for a second, just long enough for the man's gaze to drop to the paper again. "You keep it close," he observed, not asking, just stating. Clara's grip on Ethan tightened slightly, instinctively. "It is nothing," she said again, but the repetition only made it sound more fragile, more like something she was trying to convince herself of. The man took a single step closer, stopping just short of crossing the invisible line she had drawn around her child, and this time, when he spoke, his voice softened. Not in kindness, but in certainty. "It is not nothing," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "It is the reason I am here." Clara felt her pulse spike, sharp and immediate, because that meant this was not coincidence, not chance. This had been building long before today, long before he walked into that cafe. She swallowed, her throat tight. "You are wrong," she said, but the words lacked conviction now, and he saw it. "Of course he did, then prove it," he replied calmly, and that was the trap, not force, not pressure, but something far more dangerous, an invitation she could not accept without exposing everything. Ethan shifted again, pressing closer to her side, and Clara made a decision in that moment, not because it was safe, but because it was the only one she had left. She straightened, meeting his gaze fully, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. "We are leaving," she said, and this time, she did not wait for a response. She turned, guiding Ethan toward the car, each step measured, controlled, refusing to run, refusing to show weakness. But as she reached for the door handle, she heard his voice again, low, certain, carrying just enough to stop her without raising it. "You can walk away," he said, and Clara froze, her fingers resting against the metal. "But you cannot take him out of what he is." And that was the moment everything inside her shifted, not fear, not panic, but something deeper, something colder, because for the first time, she realized he was not just looking for her, he was looking for Ethan, and he already believed he had found him. Clara did not turn back immediately because turning back would mean engaging, and engaging meant stepping into something she had spent years avoiding, but her hand remained frozen on the car door. Fingers curled slightly against the cool metal as his words settled into something heavier than sound. Ethan stayed close to her side, quiet now, sensing the shift even if he could not understand it. The parking lot felt too open, too exposed, every passing car suddenly louder, every movement sharper, and still, he stood behind her without closing the distance, without forcing anything, as if he knew she would turn eventually, because she always would when the truth was placed just close enough to touch. Clara exhaled slowly, steadying herself, then turned, not fully, just enough to meet his gaze again. "You do not know anything about him," she said, her voice controlled but lower now, more guarded, because this was no longer about deflection, this was about drawing a line. But he did not argue, did not challenge her directly, he simply watched her for a moment longer before speaking again. "I know enough," he said quietly, his eyes shifting briefly to Ethan, then back to her. "Children do not carry history like that by accident." Clara felt a flicker of something sharp move through her chest, not fear this time, but resistance, because he was getting too close, not physically, but in the way that mattered, the way that reached into things she had buried deep enough to almost forget. "You are seeing what you want to see," she replied, firmer now, but he shook his head once, slow, certain. "No," he said, "I am seeing what I was told to find." And that changed everything, not in volume, not in movement, but in meaning. Clara's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, too small for anyone else to notice, but not for him, never for him. "By who?" she asked, before she could stop herself, and there it was, the first real question, the first step she had not planned to take. His gaze held hers, steady, unreadable, "Someone who has been looking for a very long time," he answered, and Clara felt the ground beneath her certainty begin to shift, because that meant this was bigger than him, bigger than chance, bigger than a single encounter. This had roots, time, intention. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve again. "Mom, I am cold," he said softly, and the simplicity of it broke through everything for a moment. Clara immediately softened, crouching slightly, pulling his jacket tighter around him, her hands gentle, practiced. "We are going home now," she said. And this time, she meant it, not as reassurance, but as a decision, because staying here any longer was no longer an option. She stood again, her posture straightening, her expression settling into something firmer, something resolved, and when she looked at the man again, there was a shift in her eyes too, not fear, not uncertainty, but clarity. "You should stop looking," she said quietly, each word measured, "because whatever you think you found, you are wrong." For a moment, silence stretched between them, the air still, the space charged with something unspoken, and then, unexpectedly, the man's expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Clara saw it, a faint trace of something almost like recognition, not of her words, but of her resolve. "If I am wrong," he said slowly, his voice just as calm as before, "then you have nothing to worry about," and the logic of it was simple, almost gentle, but it was also a challenge, one she could not accept without risking everything. Clara held his gaze for 1 second longer, then turned without another word, opening the car door and guiding Ethan inside, her movement steady, controlled, refusing to rush, refusing to show that anything had changed. But as she closed the door and moved to the driver's side, she felt it again, that presence, that certainty behind her, not chasing, not forcing, just waiting, because he did not need to follow, not yet. He had already seen enough, and as Clara started the engine, her hands steady on the wheel, she understood something she had been avoiding since the moment he walked into the cafe. This was not over, not even close, because for the first time in years, someone had not only found her, but had started to understand why she had been hiding in the first place. Clara did not check the rearview mirror right away because checking would confirm what she already felt, that he was still there, not chasing, not forcing, just existing in a way that made distance meaningless. The engine hummed steadily beneath her hands as she pulled out of the parking lot, the familiar streets unfolding ahead, quiet houses, trimmed lawns, everything exactly as it had been that morning, but nothing felt the same anymore. Ethan sat in the back seat, his small fingers tracing invisible lines against the window, his silence deeper now, more aware. "Mom," he said after a minute, his voice careful, "who was that man?" Clara tightened her grip on the steering wheel just slightly, not enough to show, just enough to anchor herself. "Someone who got confused," she answered, her tone soft but firm, the kind of answer that usually ended questions. But Ethan did not respond right away, and that pause unsettled her more than anything else, because he was thinking, processing, connecting in ways she could not always predict. "He knew your other name," Ethan said quietly, and the words landed heavier than they should have. Coming from a 6-year-old, Clara felt a slow breath move through her chest, steady, controlled. "Sometimes people think they know things they do not," she replied, keeping her eyes on the road, refusing to let her voice shift, but inside, everything was moving. Memories she had locked away pressing at the edges of her control, the name he had said, the certainty in his voice, the way he had looked at Ethan, not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with recognition, and that was what she could not ignore. The house came into view at the end of the street, small, quiet, exactly as she had chosen, a place no one would look twice at. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, the silence settling around them immediately, heavy in a way it had never been before. Ethan unbuckled slowly, watching her, waiting, and Clara turned in her seat to face him, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "Go inside and wash your hands," she said gently. "I will be right there." He hesitated for a second, then nodded, opening the door and stepping out, his small figure moving toward the front porch, and Clara watched him until the door closed behind him, until she knew he was inside, safe for now. Then she let her hands fall from the wheel, the tension she had been holding finally breaking through in a slow, controlled exhale. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers steady despite everything, scrolling through contacts she had not touched in years, names she had promised herself she would never call again. But promises like that only lasted as long as the past stayed buried, and now it was not buried anymore, not if he had found her, not if someone else had sent him. She paused on one number, her thumb hovering just above the screen, the weight of that decision settling in, because calling meant reopening everything, admitting that the life she had built was no longer enough to protect what mattered most. A car passed slowly down the street, its movement reflected briefly in her side mirror, and without meaning to, Clara's eyes shifted to it, just for a second, just long enough to remind her of something she could not ignore. He had not followed her. Not directly, but that did not mean he would not. Not later, not when it mattered more. She lowered her hand slightly, the phone still in her grasp, her thoughts aligning into something clearer, sharper, because this was no longer about hiding, it was about understanding what he knew, how he knew it, and why Ethan had become part of it. She stepped out of the car, the evening air cooler now, quieter, and as she walked toward the front door, she made a decision she had avoided for years. She would not run again, not blindly, not without answers, because if someone had been looking for her, for them, then the truth was already moving closer, whether she was ready or not. And somewhere behind that truth was a question she could no longer ignore, not after the way he had looked at her son, not after the certainty in his voice, not after the name he had spoken without hesitation. Clara Rossi was no longer just a memory, it was a key, and someone had just found the door it opened. Clara closed the door behind her with a soft click, the sound quieter than usual but carrying more weight, as if it marked a line between two versions of her life. Ethan was already in the kitchen, standing on the small step stool by the sink, carefully washing his hands the way she had taught him, precise, methodical, and for a moment, everything looked normal again, the warm light above the counter, the faint smell of coffee still clinging to her clothes, the quiet hum of a home that had been safe for so long, but safety felt different now, thinner, like something that could be pulled away with one wrong move. Clara set her bag down slowly, her eyes never leaving Ethan, watching the way he moved, the way he thought, the small details she had once taken comfort in now shifting into something she could not fully ignore. "Mom," Ethan said without turning, "why did he look at me like that?" The question came out simple, but it carried a weight that did not belong to a child. Clara stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on the edge of the counter, grounding herself in something familiar. "Sometimes people see things that are not really there," she said gently, but even as she spoke, she knew the words were not enough, not anymore. Ethan turned off the water and looked at her, his eyes searching her face in a way that made her chest tighten. He was not confused, he said quietly, and Clara felt something shift again, deeper this time, because Ethan did not say things like that without reason. He did not guess, he noticed, and that meant he had seen something too, something she could not explain away. Clara forced a small smile, stepping closer and drying his hands with a towel, her movements calm, practiced. "You do not need to worry about him," she said, softer now, but Ethan did not respond, he simply nodded, as if accepting the answer without fully believing it. And that silence said more than any question could have. Clara led him toward the living room, turning on the television, filling the space with sound, something light, something normal, anything to push back the quiet that had settled too deeply into the house. Ethan sat on the couch, his attention shifting slowly to the screen, and Clara watched him for a moment longer before stepping away, moving down the hallway toward her bedroom, closing the door behind her just enough to create distance, her hand reaching into the drawer beside her bed, pulling out a small wooden box she had not opened in years. The surface worn, familiar, and heavier than it should have been. She set it on the bed and hesitated, her fingers resting on the lid as memories pressed forward, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, persistent, because opening it meant acknowledging everything she had tried to leave behind, but leaving it closed was no longer an option, not after today, not after him. She lifted the lid slowly, revealing the contents inside, a few documents, a photograph, and a small pendant, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but to her, it was a symbol of everything she had walked away from, everything she had tried to protect Ethan from. Her fingers brushed against it lightly, and for a moment, she allowed herself to remember, not fully, not all at once, just enough to feel the weight of it again, the choices, the consequences, the reason she had run in the first place. A sound from the living room pulled her back. The television, Ethan shifting on the couch, the normalcy of it, grounding her again, reminding her what mattered now. She closed the box halfway, her mind sharper, clearer, because the question was no longer whether the past had found her, it had, the question was what it wanted, and more importantly, what it already knew. Her phone rested on the nightstand, the number still there, waiting, and This time, when she picked it up, her hesitation was gone, her thumb pressing the screen with quiet certainty. The line rang once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end, low, familiar, unchanged despite the years. "You should not be calling," it said calmly, and Clara closed her eyes for a brief second before responding, her voice steady, controlled, but carrying the weight of everything she had kept silent for so long. "He found me," she said, and the silence that followed was not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, as if this moment had always been expected, as if it had only been a matter of time. The silence on the other end of the line stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, not hesitation but calculation, and Clara stood still in the dim light of her bedroom, the small wooden box still open on the bed beside her, her fingers resting lightly against its edge as if it anchored her to something real. "How long?" the voice finally asked, calm, measured, unchanged by time, and Clara exhaled slowly before answering. "I do not know, but he knew my name," she said quietly, her eyes drifting toward the door, toward the faint sound of the television in the other room, grounding herself in the presence of her son, the reason she had made every decision that led her here. There was another pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet shift in tone, not alarm, not urgency, but something more precise. "Then it is already further than we expected," the voice replied, and Clara felt that familiar tightening in her chest, not fear exactly, but the recognition of something unfolding the way it always had, step by step, inevitable once it began. "He saw Ethan," she added, her voice lower now, and that changed the silence that followed, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if the weight of that detail settled into something neither of them could ignore. "Did he say anything?" the voice asked, and Clara closed her eyes briefly, recalling the exact words, the certainty behind them. "He said Ethan cannot be separated from what he is," she answered, and even repeating it made it feel more real, more dangerous. The response came slower this time, more deliberate. "Then he is not guessing," the voice said quietly, and Clara opened her eyes, her gaze hardening slightly as she looked down at the pendant in the box, its surface catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate. "No," she said, "he is not." Another pause, then a soft exhale on the other end, the kind that came from someone who had seen this pattern before, who understood exactly where it could lead. "You should have called sooner," the voice said, not accusing, just stating a fact. And Clara felt the edge of something sharp move through her thoughts. "I did not think anyone could find us," she replied, and that was the truth, or at least the version of it she had believed until today. "They were always going to look," the voice answered, calm, steady. "You just made it harder." Clara glanced toward the door again, her mind shifting, aligning, because this was no longer about what she had done, it was about what came next. "What do I do now?" she asked, and the question felt heavier than it should have, because she already knew the answer would not be simple. The response came without hesitation this time, clear, direct. "You do not run," the voice said, and Clara felt something in her chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the finality of it. "Running only confirms what they suspect," the voice continued. "You stay where you are, you watch, and you wait." Clara frowned slightly, her grip tightening on the phone. "Wait for what?" she asked, and the answer came softer, but no less certain. "For him to decide what he believes," the voice said. And that was the part Clara could not control, not fully, because belief was not something she could shape once it had already begun forming. Her eyes drifted back to the pendant, to the past it represented, and then to the present waiting just outside her door. "And if he is right?" she asked quietly, and this time, the silence that followed was different, longer, heavier, filled with something unspoken. Something neither of them wanted to name too quickly. "Then everything changes," the voice finally said, and Clara felt the truth of that settle into something cold and steady, because everything had already started to change. She could feel it, in the way Ethan had looked at her, in the way the man had spoken, in the way the past no longer felt distant. She lowered the phone slightly, her thoughts sharper now, more focused. "There is something else," she said, and the voice on the other end responded immediately, attentive, waiting. "He was not alone," Clara continued, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recalled the subtle details she had almost ignored, the way the cafe had shifted, the way the space had felt watched even before she noticed him. "He did not need to be," the voice replied, and that simple statement carried more weight than any explanation, because it meant what she already suspected, that this was not a single thread, not a single person, it was something larger, something organized, something patient. Clara ended the call a moment later, the quiet of the room settling back around her, but it did not feel the same anymore, not after what she now understood. She closed the wooden box slowly, her hand lingering on the lid for just a second before stepping back, her gaze steady, her breathing even, because whatever came next, whatever he believed, whatever he decided, she would not be caught unprepared again, not this time, not when everything she had been protecting was already standing in the center of it. Clara stood still for a moment after ending the call, the quiet in her bedroom pressing in differently now, no longer peaceful but alert, like the house itself was listening. She moved with purpose this time, not rushed, not panicked, but deliberate, closing the wooden box and sliding it back into the drawer before turning toward the door, every step measured as she returned to the living room. Ethan was still on the couch, his eyes fixed on the television but his posture too still, too aware. He glanced at her the moment she entered, as if he had been waiting. "Are we moving again?" he asked softly, and the question stopped her for just a second, not because of the words, but because of how easily he said them. Like it was something normal, something expected. Clara forced a small smile as she sat beside him, her hand brushing lightly over his hair. "No," she said gently, "we are staying right here." Ethan studied her face for a moment, searching for something deeper than the answer, then nodded slowly, accepting it, but not fully convinced. Clara turned her attention to the screen, letting the noise fill the space. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail, every word, every look, aligning them into something clearer, sharper, because now she understood this was not just about being found, it was about being watched, observed. Long before today, her gaze drifted toward the window, the curtain slightly open, revealing the quiet street outside. Nothing moved, no unfamiliar cars, no figures lingering. Everything looked exactly as it should, and that was what made it more unsettling, because if they were watching, they would not be obvious, not careless, they would wait, patient, precise, just like him. Clara stood slowly, walking toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass, layered over the outside world. She adjusted the curtain just slightly, enough to limit the view without drawing attention, a small action, almost meaningless on its own, but it gave her a sense of control she needed right now. Behind her, Ethan shifted on the couch, the soft rustle of movement grounding her again, reminding her what mattered. She turned back, her expression softer now, more focused. "How about we order pizza tonight?" she said, her tone light, normal, and Ethan's face brightened just a little, the tension easing in a way that made her chest tighten for a different reason, because he deserved normal, he deserved simple moments like this without the weight of everything surrounding them. "Can I pick the toppings?" he asked. And Clara nodded, a genuine smile touching her lips. "This time, of course," she said, watching as he reached for the phone on the table, already focused on something small, something safe. Clara moved into the kitchen, leaning lightly against the counter as she watched him from a distance, her mind still working, still connecting pieces, because staying did not mean doing nothing, it meant preparing, observing, waiting for the moment when something shifted again, when the next move revealed itself. Her eyes drifted once more toward the window, the fading light outside casting long shadows across the street, and for just a second, she thought she saw something, not movement exactly, just a presence, a feeling that someone was there, watching without being seen. But when she looked again, there was nothing, just the quiet suburban road, unchanged, untouched. Clara straightened slowly, her breathing steady, because whether she saw it or not did not matter. She knew now that this was no longer a question of if they were being watched, but when and how. And somewhere out there, beyond the calm surface of her carefully built life, someone was already deciding what to do next, someone who had looked at her son and seen something she could no longer pretend was not there. Clara closed her eyes for just a brief second, then opened them again, sharper, more resolved, because waiting did not mean weakness, it meant readiness. And when the next moment came, when the silence finally broke, she would be ready to face it, not as someone running from the past, but as someone who understood exactly what was at stake, and what she was willing to protect. The evening settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost convincing, the soft glow of the television flickering across the living room while Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor now, pizza box open in front of him, carefully picking off toppings he did not like. The normalcy of it creating a fragile illusion Clara did not trust. She leaned against The kitchen counter, watching him with a calm expression that hid the constant movement of her thoughts, every detail of the day still replaying, aligning into something sharper, something that refused to fade, because nothing about that encounter had been random, not the timing, not the words, not the way he had looked at Ethan as if he had been searching for him long before today. Ethan laughed softly at something on the screen, a brief, light sound that pulled Clara's attention back to the present, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to exist in that small pocket of peace, but it did not last, because the sound came then, soft, controlled, 3 measured knocks at the front door, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate in a way that made her entire body go still. Ethan looked up immediately, his smile fading just slightly. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked, and Clara did not answer right away. Because the truth was simple, she never expected anyone, not here, not anymore. Her eyes moved slowly toward the door, her posture straightening, every instinct sharpening at once. "Stay here," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, and Ethan nodded, watching her closely as she stepped away from the kitchen, each movement measured, controlled, the house suddenly feeling smaller, quieter, the air heavier. With anticipation, she approached the door without rushing, her hand resting lightly against the wall beside it as she paused, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, just silence on the other side, and that silence told her more than any sound could have, because it meant whoever was there was waiting, not knocking again, not pushing, just waiting for her to decide. Clara reached for the handle slowly, her breath steady, her mind clear, because hesitation would not change what was already happening. She opened the door just enough to see, and there he was, exactly as she expected, standing on her porch like he had every right to be there, his presence just as controlled, just as deliberate as before, his gaze meeting hers immediately, not searching, not questioning, just certain. "You found the address quickly," Clara said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension settling beneath it, and he inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement rather than an answer. "You did not hide as well as you think," he replied calmly, and the words carried no judgment, only fact. Clara held the door in place, not opening it further, not stepping back, maintaining the boundary she still believed she could control. "You should not be here," she said, and this time, there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to redirect, just a clear line drawn between them, but he did not move, did not react, his eyes shifting briefly past her, toward the faint light of the living room where Ethan still sat, unaware of how close everything had come. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice lower now, more precise. "This is not something you can leave behind." Clara felt the weight of those words settle deeper, because they were no longer just a warning, they were a confirmation. This was already in motion, already beyond the point where distance could solve it. She tightened her grip on the door slightly, her gaze hardening as she met his again. "Then say what you came to say," she replied, her voice controlled, but sharper now, because she was done pretending this could be avoided. For a moment, he simply watched her, as if measuring something, not her fear, not her reaction, but her resolve, and then he spoke, not louder, not harsher, just clearer. "The boy," he said, and even those 2 words were enough to shift everything again. "He is not just yours." Clara's breath stilled, not visibly, not enough for him to see fully, but enough for her to feel it, that shift, that moment where everything she had protected stood directly between them, and for the first time, she realized this was not just about being found, it was about being claimed, and the difference between those 2 things was something she could no longer ignore. Clara did not move when he said it, not immediately, because reacting too fast would give him more than she was willing to show, but inside, something shifted, something deeper than fear, something closer to recognition, because those words were not a guess, they were a conclusion, and conclusions came from certainty. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the door, her posture still controlled, still steady. "You do not get to decide that," she said quietly, her voice even, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now, something protective, something unyielding. He did not argue, did not push the statement back, he simply held her gaze, as if the truth between them did not need to be debated, only acknowledged. "I am not deciding," he replied calmly, "I am recognizing," and that difference settled into the space between them with a weight Clara could not ignore, because recognition meant he had seen something undeniable, something she could not erase with distance or denial. Behind her, the television continued to play, a soft Distant noise that felt disconnected from everything happening at the door, but then there was movement, small, careful, Ethan stepping closer, drawn by the quiet tension he could feel even without understanding it. "Mom," he called softly, and Clara's entire focus shifted instantly, her body turning just enough to block the view inside, to keep that invisible line intact. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice gentle but firm. And Ethan stopped, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. The man's gaze followed the movement, just for a second, and that was enough for Clara to see it again, that same controlled pause, that same recognition forming behind his expression. "He is aware," the man said quietly, almost to himself, and Clara felt something tighten in her chest, because awareness meant questions, and questions meant time was running out faster than she had planned. "You need to leave," she said again, this time more direct, her grip on the door steady, her stance unmoving, but he did not step back, did not turn away. Instead, he reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, not in a way that threatened, but in a way that signaled intention. Clara's body tensed slightly, every instinct alert, but he only pulled out a small folded piece of paper, holding it between his fingers for a moment before extending it toward her, stopping just short of crossing the threshold. "You will want this," he said, and his tone did not change, still calm, still certain, but something in it carried a quiet urgency that had not been there before. Clara hesitated, her eyes moving from his face to the paper, every instinct telling her not to take anything from him, not to accept anything that connected them further, but another part of her understood that refusing would not stop what was already happening. It would only leave her blind to it. She reached out slowly, taking the paper. Without stepping closer, without breaking the boundary she still held on to, their fingers did not touch, but the distance between them felt smaller now, more fragile. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents, and for the first time since he had appeared, her composure faltered, not visibly to anyone else, but inside, everything shifted, because it was not just a name, not just a location, it was a date, a record, something official, something that should not exist anymore. Something she had made sure was erased. Her gaze lifted back to him, sharper now, more focused. "This is not possible," she said quietly, and for the first time, there was something in her voice she could not fully contain, not fear, but disbelief. He watched her for a moment, as if waiting for that exact reaction. "It is not only possible," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "it is already being questioned." Clara felt the weight of that settle into something colder, something more urgent, because questioning meant attention, and attention meant exposure. "Who has this?" she asked, and this time, she did not hide the need for an answer, because this was no longer just about him, it was about everyone else who might be looking. His gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. "The people who were there," he said simply, and Clara understood immediately, not the details, not the full picture, but enough to know that this was no longer contained, no longer controlled. The past she had buried was not just resurfacing, it was being reopened, piece by piece, and she was no longer the only one holding the pieces. She folded the paper again slowly, her mind already moving, already recalculating everything she thought she knew, everything she thought she had secured, and when she looked at him again, there was no hesitation left, only clarity. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, and the question was direct, sharp, because nothing about this was accidental, nothing about him ever was. He did not answer right away, his gaze shifting briefly toward the house behind her, toward the life she had built, and then back to her. "Because if I found you," he said quietly, "someone else will too." And that was the moment Clara realized this was not a warning, not entirely, it was a countdown, and whatever time she thought she had left had just become something far more limited than she was ready for. Clara did not close the door after he spoke, not immediately, because closing it would feel like pretending she still had control over where this ended, and she knew now that control had already shifted, not completely, but enough to matter. The paper remained in her hand, folded but heavier than it should have been, her mind moving quickly through every possibility, every angle, every consequence that could come from what he had just shown her. "You are assuming I need your help," she said quietly, her voice steady again, reclaiming some of the ground she had almost lost, and for a moment, something unreadable passed through his expression, not amusement, not doubt, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if he expected resistance and respected it. "You do not need my help," he replied calmly, but you need the truth. And that word settled differently now, sharper, more immediate. Because truth was no longer something distant, it was here, at her door, asking to be faced. Behind her, Ethan shifted again, closer this time, his presence just within reach, and Clara felt the pull of two worlds at once, the one she had built and the one she had left behind, both demanding her attention, both impossible to ignore. "Mom," Ethan said softly, his voice carrying a quiet insistence, and Clara turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, grounding herself again in something real, something she would not let go of. "It is okay," she said gently, though the words felt thinner now, less certain, because everything around them was shifting too fast. The man watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze steady, observant, taking in every detail without needing to move closer, and that stillness was what made him more dangerous than anything else, because he did not rush, he did not force, he simply waited for the moment when truth revealed itself on its own. Clara turned back to him, her posture straightening again, her voice lower now, more deliberate. "If others are looking," she said, "why warn me?" The question hung between them, sharp, direct, because nothing about this made sense without a reason, and he did not answer immediately, his eyes shifting briefly toward the street behind him, then back to her, as if measuring the weight of what he was about to say. "Because they will not ask questions," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone now that had not been there before, not softer, not kinder, but more certain, more final. Clara felt that settle into something cold and clear, because questions meant time, and time was the only thing she had left to work with. She glanced down at the paper again, the details still sharp in her mind, the date, the record, the confirmation that something she had erased was now being rewritten. "And you will?" she asked, and this time, her voice carried something different, not challenge, not resistance, but calculation, because if he was here with answers instead of force, that meant something. His gaze held hers for a moment longer, then he nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I already am," he said, and that answer changed the shape of everything again, because it meant this was not a pursuit, not yet, it was an investigation, a search for understanding, and that gave her something she had not expected, not safety, but space, a narrow window where decisions could still be made, where outcomes could still be influenced. Clara exhaled slowly, her grip on the door easing just slightly, not opening it further, but no longer holding it as tightly as before. "Then ask," she said quietly, the words measured, controlled, but carrying the weight of a decision she had not planned to make tonight, because asking meant revealing, and revealing meant stepping closer to a truth she had spent years avoiding. His expression did not change, but his focus sharpened, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. "The night you disappeared," he began, his voice low, precise. "What did you take with you?" The question landed deeper than anything else he had said so far, not because of the words, but because of what they implied, that he already knew she had not left empty-handed, that he understood there was something missing from that night, something that connected directly to Ethan. Clara felt her pulse steady rather than spike, her thoughts aligning into something clearer, because this was the moment she had been preparing for without realizing it. The moment where running was no longer an option and silence was no longer protection. She looked at him fully now, no hesitation, no deflection, just clarity, and for the first time since he arrived, her voice carried no uncertainty at all. "I did not take something," she said quietly, and the truth settled into the space between them with a quiet finality. "I took someone." And behind her, Ethan stood still, unaware that in that moment, everything about his past had just been brought back into the light. The words settled into the space between them with a quiet weight that did not need explanation, and for the first time since he arrived, the man did not respond immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he did, completely, his gaze shifting past Clara, not searching anymore, but confirming, as if everything he had been piecing together had just aligned into something undeniable. "You took him," he repeated softly, not as a question, but as recognition, and Clara did not look away, her posture steady, her expression calm in a way that had taken years to build, because this was the truth she had protected, the line she would not let anyone cross without resistance. "I protected him," she corrected quietly, and that distinction mattered, not just to her, but to everything that had led them here. Behind her, Ethan stood still, watching, listening, his small presence suddenly at the center of something far bigger than he could understand. The man's gaze returned to Clara, sharper now, more focused. From who? He asked, and the question was simple, but it carried layers Clara could not unfold all at once. Not here, not like this. She exhaled slowly, her mind moving through memories she had locked away, choosing carefully what to reveal, because every word mattered now. From people who would not have seen him as a child, she said, her voice low, controlled, and something shifted in the man's expression. Not shock, not disbelief, but something closer to alignment, as if her answer confirmed more than it explained. And you think that has changed? He asked, and this time, there was something different in his tone, not challenge, but a quiet test. Clara's gaze hardened slightly, her hand moving instinctively to rest against the edge of the door, grounding herself. I think I gave him a chance to be something else, she replied, and that was the truth she held on to, the reason she had run, the reason she had stayed hidden, the reason she would not step aside now. The man studied her for a long moment, his silence no longer passive, but active, as if weighing every word, every decision she had made. You gave him time, he said finally, and Clara felt that distinction settle into something sharper, because time was not the same as freedom, not the same as escape, and time is running out, he added quietly, and the words carried no urgency, no threat, just certainty, the kind that came from someone who understood how quickly things could shift once attention was focused in the right direction. Clara glanced briefly toward Ethan, then back to him, her voice steady but firmer now. Then help me keep it, she said, and the request was not weak, not desperate, it was calculated, because if he was here with answers instead of force, then he was not her enemy yet. The man's expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes shifted again, something more deliberate, more personal, as if her words had moved the situation from observation into decision. You are asking me to stand between him and what he is, he said, and Clara did not hesitate this time, her answer immediate, certain. I am asking you to see what he could be, and that was the difference she had been fighting for since the beginning, not denial, not escape, but possibility. The man held her gaze for a moment longer, then his eyes moved once more toward Ethan, and this time, the look was different, not just recognition, not just calculation, but something more complex, something that did not resolve easily, as if the future he had expected and the reality in front of him did not fully align. The silence stretched between them again, heavier now, filled with everything unspoken, until finally, he took a step back, not retreating, but shifting the balance just enough to signal something had changed. If I choose to believe you, he said slowly, his voice lower now, more deliberate, then I am not the only one you need to convince. And Clara understood immediately, because belief was not isolated, it moved, it spread, and if others were already looking, already questioning, then this was only the beginning. She tightened her grip on the door slightly, her resolve sharpening again. Then tell me who else is coming, she said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only clarity, because whatever came next, she needed to be ready for it, not just for herself, but for Ethan. The man watched her for a moment longer, then his gaze shifted briefly toward the street behind him, as if measuring something beyond her view, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everything inside her still. Not who, he said quietly. What? And that single word changed everything again, because it meant this was no longer just about people searching, it was about something larger, something structured, something that did not stop once it started, and Clara felt the full weight of it settle in. Not as fear, but as certainty, because whatever she had taken that night, whatever she had protected all these years, was not just wanted, it was expected, and now, it was being claimed. Clara did not speak right away because that single word lingered in the air longer than anything else he had said. Not who, but what, and it reshaped everything she thought she was facing. Her grip on the door loosened just slightly, not from weakness, but from the realization that this was no longer a situation she could define on her own terms. Ethan stood just behind her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, and that grounded her again, pulled her focus back to what mattered most. Then explain it, she said quietly, her voice steady, not demanding, but firm enough to show she would not step back from this. The man studied her for a moment, his expression unchanged, but his gaze sharper now, more deliberate, as if deciding how much to reveal. It is not a person or a group, he said slowly, choosing his words with care. It is a system that does not forget what belongs to it. Clara felt a cold clarity settle in, because that meant something deeper than pursuit, something that operated beyond individuals, beyond time, something that continued whether people changed or not, and you are part of it, she said, not as an accusation, but as a fact she needed to confirm. He did not deny it, did not soften it, he simply held her gaze. I am aware of it, he replied, and the distinction mattered. Because awareness meant distance, not full alignment, and that gave her something she could work with, something she could still influence. Behind her, Ethan shifted slightly, his voice small but steady. Mom, are we leaving? And Clara felt the question settle deeper than anything else, because leaving had always been her answer, her instinct, her solution, but now, leaving meant walking into something she did not understand, running without direction, and that was no longer enough. She turned slightly, her hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder, her voice soft but certain. Not tonight, she said, and for the first time since everything began, she meant it without hesitation. The man watched that exchange closely, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, not doubt, not resistance, but something closer to recognition, as if the choice she had just made aligned with something he had already anticipated. Staying will not stop it, he said quietly. And Clara nodded once, her gaze returning to him, steady. Resolved. I know, she replied, but running will not either, and that was the truth she had reached, not through fear, but through understanding, because this was no longer about escape, it was about facing what had already arrived. The man held her gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back another inch, the distance between them widening just enough to signal a shift. Not an end, but a pause. Then be ready, he said, his voice low, certain, carrying the weight of something final, and Clara felt that settle into her, not as a warning, but as a reality she had already accepted. She nodded once, slow, deliberate, because readiness was the only thing she had left to control, the only thing she could build now that the past had caught up. He turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth movement that carried the same control he had shown from the beginning, walking away from the porch without looking back, without needing to confirm anything further, because whatever he needed to know had already been revealed. Clara stood there for a moment longer, the quiet of the street returning around her, but it no longer felt the same. It felt thinner, more temporary, like something that could shift at any moment. She closed the door slowly, the soft click echoing through the house. And when she turned back, Ethan was still there, watching her. Waiting, she walked toward him, her movements calm, her expression steady, and as she knelt slightly to meet his eyes, there was no hesitation left in her voice. Everything is going to change, she said softly, not as a warning, but as a truth she could no longer protect him from. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then nodded in that quiet, understanding way that had always set him apart. And Clara felt something settle into place inside her, not fear, not doubt, but resolve, because whatever was coming, whatever that system was, whatever it wanted, she would not let it define him without a fight. She stood again, her gaze lifting toward the window, toward the darkness settling outside, and for the first time since it all began, she did not look for who might be watching. She thought about what was coming, and how she would meet it, because some pasts do not just return, they arrive with purpose, and this time, she would not run from it, she would make it face her.